The knock came just after dusk, soft at first, almost swallowed by the prairie wind that scraped along the ranch house like restless fingers. He nearly missed it. The rancher, Evan Cole, had learned to live with silence so complete it felt like a second skin. Nights like this were usually his domain. The crackle of the stove, the creak of old wood, the low murmur of cattle settling beyond the fence. When the knock came again, firmer this time, it startled him enough that his chair scraped the floor. He opened the door to a slice of cold so sharp it bit his lungs. Standing on the porch was a woman, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen better winters. Her boots were dusted white with frost, her hair pulled back in a simple braid that had loosened during travel. She held a small, worn valise to her chest like a shield. Her eyes met his, dark, determined, and edged with a kind of fear that didn't beg, but endured. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't waver. That somehow made them heavier. Evan hesitated, one hand still on the doorframe. Mail-order bride, his mind supplied immediately, the same way a scar remembers pain. He'd answered an advertisement once, years ago, back when hope felt practical. Letters had passed between him and a woman from the East, inked dreams, promises of shared mornings and steady work. She'd arrived smiling and left before the week was out, unable to bear the isolation, the wind, the quiet man who didn't know how to be anything else. Since then, Evan had kept his distance from expectations, especially ones that arrived carrying suitcases. "You're at the wrong place," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The town's 5 miles back." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't look away. "I know. I already went there." The way she said it told him all he needed to know about closed doors and polite refusals. He glanced past her into the dark, the road swallowed by night. Leaving her there felt wrong in a way that went beyond courtesy. The cold had a way of deciding things if people didn't. "One night," he said at last. "I can give you shelter for one night. That's all." Relief flickered across her face, quick and carefully contained. She nodded, as if she'd been prepared for less. "Thank you." He stepped aside, letting her pass. She moved cautiously, like someone who expected the offer to vanish if she walked too confidently. The house seemed to notice her immediately, the air shifting, the shadows rearranging themselves around a second presence. Evan closed the door and set the latch, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "I'm Evan," he said, shrugging out of his coat. "You can leave your things there." "Clara," she replied, setting the valise near the wall. Her hands lingered on the handle for a moment before she straightened, as if letting go required effort. The kitchen was small but clean, lit by a single lamp that cast a warm circle against the encroaching dark. Evan gestured toward a chair. "You look cold." "I am," she admitted, finally allowing herself to rub her hands together. Her voice carried an accent softened by travel, by years perhaps of adjusting herself to new places. He poured water into a kettle, the familiar routine grounding him. The stove caught with a hiss, and for a moment they stood in companionable silence, strangers sharing the same narrow space. She looked around, taking in the worn table, the neatly stacked firewood, the faded photograph of a younger Evan with his parents, all three squinting into a sun that no longer shone on this house. "It's quieter than I expected," she said. "That's the prairie," he replied. "It lets you hear yourself think." Her smile was small. Sometimes that's the problem. When he showed her the spare room, he felt oddly protective of its simplicity, the narrow bed, the quilt his mother had sewn, the washbasin polished by habit. "You'll be warm enough," he said, more statement than question. She set her valise on the bed and turned to face him. "I won't be any trouble," she promised, as if trouble were a choice she could simply decline. He nodded, unsure how to respond. At the door, he paused. "Supper's in a bit, if you're hungry." "I am," she said softly. Then, after a beat, "But thank you, even if it's only for tonight." Evan left her there and closed the door gently. As he returned to the kitchen, the house no longer felt quite as empty. That realization unsettled him more than the knock had, because it reminded him how long he'd been alone, and how easily one night could change the shape of everything. Supper came together the way most things did in Evan's life, quietly, without ceremony, built from what was already on hand. He sliced bread thick and set it to warm near the stove, stirred beans that had been simmering since afternoon, and added the last of the smoked beef he'd been saving for winter. The smells filled the kitchen, humble but steady, curling into the corners as if trying to make themselves at home. When he called Clara in, she stepped out of the spare room with a care that suggested she was measuring the floorboards, learning where it was safe to place her weight. They sat across from each other at the small table, the lamp between them like a mediator. For a while, the only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the wind tapping the windows. Evan wasn't a man of easy conversation. Years of solitude had taught him that words, like tools, were best used only when needed. Clara ate slowly, as though each bite mattered, as though she didn't know when the next warm meal would come. That knowledge settled heavily in his chest. "This is good," she said at last, looking up. I didn't expect much." He nodded, unsure whether to apologize or accept the compliment. "It's what I had." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's more than enough." The lamp flickered, and Evan adjusted the wick. "So," he began, then stopped. The question he wanted to ask, why she'd come, what she'd expected, felt too sharp for the fragile peace between them. Instead, he tried again. "You traveled far?" "Yes." She folded her napkin carefully, as if tidiness might anchor her. "Farther than I thought I would." That opened the door. She spoke of letters written by a man whose words had been warm and certain, who'd promised partnership and a place to belong. She hadn't known the land, she admitted, not really, not the distances, not the way isolation could press in on a person until it reshaped them. When she arrived, the man was gone, claimed by illness or fear, or maybe just the truth catching up to him. The town had listened, sympathetic but busy, and offered her advice instead of help. Evan listened without interrupting. He recognized the shape of disappointment in her story, it mirrored his own too closely. When she finished, she lifted her eyes, braced for judgment. "Not everyone's made for this place," he said simply. "Doesn't make them weak." Relief softened her shoulders. "I keep telling myself that." He found himself speaking then, surprised by his own voice filling the room. He told her about the ranch, how his parents had carved it from stubborn earth, how he'd stayed after they passed, believing duty and love were the same thing. He spoke of the first woman who'd come by mail, of how hope had felt like a language he didn't quite speak. "I'm not good with promises," he finished. "The land teaches you that most things are temporary." Clara considered that. And yet the land stays. Only because someone keeps choosing it. The fire popped, sending sparks of light dancing across the walls. Outside, the cattle lowed softly, a lullaby Evan barely noticed anymore. The house felt different tonight, warmer, not just from the stove, but from the presence of another story intersecting with his own. When supper ended, Clara stood to help, but he waved her off. "You're a guest. For one night," she reminded him. Still, she hesitated, then sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I'll leave at first light," she said. "I don't want to impose." He washed the dishes slowly, the rhythm soothing. "You won't be thrown out in the dark," he said. "We're not monsters out here." She laughed quietly, a sound that surprised them both. It lingered in the air after it faded, like an echo of something forgotten. Later, when the lamp burned low, Evan showed her the routine of the house, where the water pump froze if left unattended, which door stuck when the wind rose. Practicalities came easily to him, they were safer than feelings. At her door, he paused, unsure how to end the night. "You'll be safe here," he said at last. "I'll lock up." "I know," she replied. Then, softer, "Thank you for listening." He nodded and retreated to his room. Sleep didn't come easily. The ceiling looked unfamiliar, as if the presence of another person had altered its shape. He listened to the sounds of the house, the settling wood, the far-off howl of a coyote, the faint movement behind the closed door across the hall. Knowing she was there, breathing the same air, unsettled him in a way that felt dangerously close to hope. Before dawn, he rose and started the stove, the habit ingrained. As the flames caught, he realized he was doing it for her as much as for himself. The thought stayed with him, heavy and quiet, as the night slowly gave way to morning. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light slipping through the thin curtains and settling over the ranch like a held breath. Frost silvered the grass, and the sky stretched white and colorless, as if undecided about the day ahead. Evan had been awake for hours, moving through his routines with a distracted care, feeding the stove, checking the latch, setting water to heat. Each task felt different now, charged with awareness, as though the house itself were listening. Clara appeared quietly in the doorway just as he set 2 tin cups on the table. She had changed into a simple dress, mended neatly at the seams, and had braided her hair again, tighter this time. The valise rested by her feet. She looked ready in the way people do when they're trying not to look hopeful. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. "Coffee. It's strong." "That's perfect." They drank in near silence, watching steam curl into the cool air. Outside, a meadowlark called, the sound sharp and bright against the hush. Clara's gaze drifted toward the window, then back to the cup in her hands. I should go soon, she said, not looking at him. Before the road turns to mud. Evan nodded. He'd expected this. One night had been the agreement, clear and clean. Still, the words tightened something in his chest. He told himself it was just the return of habit, the careful narrowing of expectations to keep disappointment manageable. She stood and lifted the valise. The door creaked as he opened it for her, and cold air rushed in, brisk and honest. The land lay open before them, vast and indifferent, the road a thin line cutting away toward uncertainty. Clara stepped onto the porch, then paused. I don't regret coming, she said. Even if it was a mistake. It wasn't, Evan said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. It just didn't work out the way you thought. She turned to face him fully then, searching his expression as if looking for the fine print she'd missed before. You're kind, she said. But I know better than to confuse kindness with something more. He felt the old reflex rise, the urge to retreat, to let things end cleanly before they tangled. He'd lived a long time inside that reflex. But the quiet of the morning pressed in, and with it came the knowledge of how empty the house had been before her knock. Stay, he said. The word surprised them both. It hung between them, simple and unadorned. He took a breath, not as an obligation, not as a promise I can't keep. Just stay. For a while. Help if you want. Leave if you need to. No letters. No expectations. Clara's grip tightened on the valise handle. You're asking a lot. I know, he said. From both of us. She looked out over the land again. The frost, the fences, the long horizon that offered neither guarantees nor traps. When she turned back, her eyes shone, not with tears but with resolve. I won't be anyone's charity, she said. I wouldn't want you to be. A long moment passed. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back, the gesture familiar already. Finally, she set the valise down at her feet. All right, she said. I'll stay. For now. Relief moved through him, quiet and steady. He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The choice felt fragile, like a seed placed carefully into the ground, uncertain whether it would take. But seeds were something he understood. They spent the morning together without ceremony. He showed her the barn, the rhythm of chores, the places where the fence needed mending come spring. She listened, asked practical questions, offered help without overstepping. When she took a broom to the porch without being asked, he felt something loosen inside him. By midday, the frost had melted, leaving the earth dark and promising. They shared a simple meal, conversation easier now, laughter finding its way in where silence had once lived. The ranch didn't feel smaller for her presence, it felt, unexpectedly, more possible. That night, as the sun sank and the prairie turned gold, Evan stood on the porch and watched Clara move through the kitchen window, light catching in her hair. He knew better than to call it certainty. Life had taught him that love, like land, demanded patience and work. But as the lamp flickered on and the house filled with warmth, he understood something else too. Sometimes shelter wasn't just a roof for the night. Sometimes it was the courage to open a door, and the grace to let someone choose to stay.